Tonight, picture a shoreline at the far edge of the known world, on a warm gray morning at the end of summer in the year 43. The tide is going out. The shingle is wet and dark where the water has just left it, and paler higher up where the sun has had time to work. There is a smell of salt and weed and cold iron. Out on the flat green water, close enough to count and too many to count quickly, there are ships. Not tall ships, not the sort that would frighten a later century. Broad, low, patient transports with square sails slack in the light air, and oars moving in a slow, sleepy rhythm, and behind them more, and behind those, more again. A line of dark shapes strung back into the haze until the haze takes them. On the beach, men are getting off. They are not shouting. That is the strange thing about it, if you could stand there and watch. It is a quiet business, an enormous quiet business, done by people who have done it before, in other places, on other beaches, with the same equipment and the same order of operations. Planks come down. Mules are led off blindfolded so they will not balk at the water. Baskets are passed hand to hand up the shingle. Somebody is already pacing out a rectangle in the turf above the tide line, because before anything else happens, before a single decision is made about this island or its people, there will be a ditch, and inside the ditch there will be a bank. And inside the bank there will be tents in straight rows, and the straight rows will be in the same arrangement they would be in on the Rhine, or in Syria, or in the mountains of Spain. Wherever the empire went, it slept inside the same rectangle. Beyond the rectangle there is a country, green, wooded, wet, thickly farmed in places and empty in others, full of people who have been living here for a very long time and who have their own kings, their own gods, their own quarrels, their own way of counting a man's worth in cattle. They know Rome. They have known it for generations in the way you know a large neighbor, through traders, through wine jars, through silver coins with foreign faces on them, through relatives who have gone away and come back with opinions. What they do not yet know is that this morning is the first morning of something that will last for 367 years. That is the whole of tonight, 367 years, from the first landing to the last legion. We are going to walk through all of it, slowly, in order, from the island before Rome ever set foot on it, through the conquest and the burning and the rebuilding, through the walls and the towns and the villas and the bathhouses, through the good centuries when a person could be born, live, grow old, and die in a Roman province and never think of it as anything but home, and then on through the long, soft, unglamorous ending. When the coins stopped coming, the roofs came down one winter at a time, and the province did not fall so much as quietly stop being one. So settle now into whatever stillness you have made for yourself tonight. Get the pillow into the shape you actually want it, rather than the shape it currently is. Let your shoulders come down away from your ears, because they have crept up again while you were not looking, and let the small weight of the day slip down off them, one quiet inch at a time. Let your hands go loose, let your jaw unclench. Let the lamp grow dim, or let it go out altogether. And let the room be whatever temperature it is going to be, without you doing anything more about it. And let me say the useful part early, while you are still able to hear it. You do not need to remember any of this. There is no test at the end, and no thread you are required to hold. If you drift off in the middle of the 1st century and wake somewhere in the 4th, you have not missed anything that will be asked of you. If you drift off in the first 3 minutes and never hear the rest at all, then this has done exactly the job it was made for, and I will be perfectly happy about it. The story has already happened. It cannot be spoiled, it cannot be lost, and it does not need you to stay awake for it. If you do enjoy what I make here, a like helps other sleepless people find their way to it. And you are very welcome to subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here, and honestly, only once you have slept. And if you feel like it, leave your location and your local time down in the comments, because there is something oddly comforting about scrolling that list at 3 in the morning and seeing that somebody in another time zone is awake too, doing the same quiet arithmetic about how many hours are left before the alarm. Now, let us go a long way back, further back than the ships. Before there was a Roman Britain, there was no Rome in these islands at all, and for a very long stretch of time there was no Rome anywhere, and the island simply got on with being an island. It had been one for a while by then, not forever. For most of human history, the land we are talking about was not an island at all, but the raised northwestern shoulder of a much larger continent, joined to the rest of it by a broad, low country of marsh and river and grazing that the sea eventually took back, slowly, over generations, in a way nobody living through it would have described as an event. People fished there. People hunted there. The water came up a little each lifetime, the way a tide comes up a beach, except that this tide did not go out again. And 1 century there was a walk to the mainland, and a good many centuries later there was not. So the island was already old and already full when farming arrived, and the farming changed it more than anything else would until the ships. Woods were opened. By the time we get near our story, most of the lowlands that later got called good farmland were already farmed, and had been for thousands of years, and the idea that Rome arrived to bring agriculture to a wilderness is one of those tidy stories that dissolves the moment you look at a pollen core. What the people of the island had by the last few centuries before our first date was iron. Iron changed what a farm could do, and what a farm could do changed how many people a place could feed, and how many people a place could feed changed everything about how those people organized themselves. More food meant more surplus. More surplus meant somebody had to decide where it went. And the deciding of where things go, in every society that has ever existed, is where the trouble and the grandeur both begin. So you get hill forts, hundreds of them, all over the west and the south and the marches, ringed with ditches and banks that still ripple through the turf today, so that if you fly low over certain hills in the west of England on a summer evening, you can see the outline of them lying in the grass like the seam of an old scar. Some were towns in everything but name, with roads and grain stores and streets of round houses. Some were empty most of the year and filled up when there was a threat or a festival. The houses themselves were round. That deserves a moment, because it is the single most persistent architectural fact of the island before the ships, and because it is easy to say the word roundhouse and picture something crude. And the reality is not crude at all. A single doorway, usually facing the sunrise, with a porch to keep the weather out. Inside, on a wet night, with the fire low and the wind going over the top of the roof, a good roundhouse is warm, dim, resin-smelling, and astonishingly quiet. And a family and their dogs and a certain amount of their livestock could live in one for a whole winter without anybody feeling especially hard done by. Around those houses, fields, small ones, squarish. bounded by banks that got taller each year as the plow threw soil up against them, growing wheat and barley and beans, with cattle in the wetter ground and sheep on the higher and pigs in the woods eating whatever fell. And around the fields, the tribes. What the island had was a patchwork of peoples, each with a name, a territory with soft edges, a ruling family, or several competing ones, a set of alliances and grudges, and a strong sense of who was and was not one of them. In the southeast, on the good corn land, the Catovayani and the Trinovantes and the Cantiachi. Curving up through the east, the Iceni in their flat country of rivers and reeds. In the west, in the hills and the valleys, the Silures and the Ordovices and the Demeti, who will matter a great deal later and who nobody in a comfortable villa in the south will ever describe as easy. And spread across the whole enormous north, the Brigantes, less a nation than a federation of everyone north of the middle, held together loosely and at times not at all. They fought each other. Not constantly, and not in the manner of an epic, mostly in the ordinary way of neighboring powers, raids for cattle, seasons of tension, marriages arranged to settle things, boundaries pushed and pushed back, one dynasty absorbing another and calling it inheritance. A young man made his name in that world by being brave in a small, dangerous, largely pointless way. And a king kept his by being generous in a large, expensive, extremely public way, which is a system that produces a great deal of fine metalwork and a certain amount of avoidable widowhood. And they were rich. That is the part the later story tends to lose. This was not a poor island. It had grain to spare, hides, hunting dogs that fetched extraordinary prices abroad, wool, salt from the coastal flats, lead and silver in the western hills, gold in the Welsh valleys, iron in the southern forests, and tin, which the whole of the ancient world wanted and only a few places had. In the harbors of the south coast, you would find wine jars from Italy, fine pottery from Gaul, glass, olive oil, and a good deal of hard bargaining conducted in a mixture of languages by people who understood one another perfectly well when the subject was price. And they were not, whatever the later telling suggests, unsophisticated. This is worth a few minutes. Because the island that the ships came to had an art of its own that is one of the great achievements of ancient Europe, and almost nobody outside a museum has ever heard of it. It is a style built entirely out of curves. No straight lines, no grids, no symmetry of the Mediterranean kind. They worked it in bronze and gold and enamel. Neck rings of twisted gold wire so heavy that wearing one must have felt like a decision. A shield facing of bronze with red glass studs made for display rather than fighting, and thrown into the river at London as an offering. Helmets with horns, a bronze carnix, a war trumpet with the head of a boar, which when it was reconstructed and played turned out to make a sound that goes straight up. The back of the neck. They fought from chariots, and this genuinely surprised the Romans, who regarded chariots as an antique curiosity out of Homer. The British had made them into something else. A light two-horse vehicle with a springy suspension of leather straps, driven at speed along a line of battle by a driver, while the warrior threw javelins from it, and then, at the moment of choice, the warrior stepped down and fought on foot while the driver withdrew a little way and waited to bring him out again. In the east of the country, in what is now Yorkshire, some of them were buried with those chariots, dismantled or whole, with the horses and the harness and a joint of pork for the journey. And they feasted, and the feast was the political system. A king's power was his ability to give, to keep a hall full of men fed and drunk and equipped, to reward loyalty visibly, to be seen being generous. There was a joint reserved for the best warrior present, which sounds charming and was in fact a formal claim that could be and was contested with weapons, since a system built on public honor has to have a public procedure for arguing about it. Their year turned on the same hinges every farming people's year turns on, with the great fires lit at the beginning of the dark half of the year and at the beginning of the light, and the animals brought down off the summer grazing, and the boundary between this world and whatever the other one was thought to be at its thinnest on the night the year changed. All of that was still entirely alive and working on the island when the first coins appeared. By the last century before our date, the southern kings were minting their own coins in gold and silver and bronze, with their names on them in Latin letters, and horses and ears of corn, and the occasional, very confident portrait. A king in the corn country of the southeast, 100 years before any legion came to stay, was stamping his name in the Roman alphabet onto Roman weight coinage, in the Roman manner to be spent by his own people. He was not being conquered. He was being fashionable and doing business and quietly announcing to the wider world that he was a serious man and not a barbarian. Which is exactly what a serious man who is worried about being called a barbarian tends to do. There were priests too, and here the sources get shrill, and we should be careful with them. The Druids were the learned class, keepers of law, memory, ritual, astronomy, poetry, and judgment, trained for many years in an oral tradition that was deliberately never written down, which is why we know so little about it and why almost everything you have ever heard about them was written by their enemies. They held certain groves sacred. What mattered strategically was that the Druids were an island-wide institution in a place with no island-wide politics. They crossed borders. They could carry a message and a grudge from one kingdom to another. And an empire that runs on keeping local powers separate from each other finds that kind of network extremely inconvenient. So that is the island, farmed, populated, armed, wealthy, quarrelsome, deeply connected to the continent, and completely without any idea of itself as a single country, because it had never needed one. And then, for the first time, the ships came, not the ones we started with. An earlier set, 97 years earlier, in the late summer of the year 55 before our era, under a man who was at that moment finishing a long and extraordinarily violent conquest of Gaul, and who had noticed that the island across the water kept helping the people he was busy conquering. He came with 2 legions, late in the season, with poor intelligence and worse luck. The cavalry transports were blown back by weather and never arrived at all. The infantry had to jump into chest-deep water on a shelving beach in the face of chariots and slingers, which is not a thing soldiers enjoy, and there is a famous moment in the account where the whole landing stalls until the standard-bearer of one legion simply goes over the side alone and wades ashore, on the grounds that his colleagues can either follow him or explain later why they did not. They followed him. They usually did. That is more or less the entire secret of the Roman army, and we will come back to it. That first expedition achieved almost nothing. The following summer he came back properly, with 5 legions and 2,000 cavalry and 800 ships, which was less an invasion fleet than a small floating city, and this time he got inland. He crossed the great river of the south. It still was not enough. Tribute was agreed, and then the whole enormous apparatus got back on its ships and sailed away. And the tribute was paid for a while and then quietly was not. and the island went back to its own business for the better part of a century. Those 97 years in between are the part everybody skips. And they are the part that explains everything, because during them, without a single soldier stationed on the island, Rome won most of the argument anyway. Trade thickened. Southern kings began to build in rectangles. They began to describe themselves on their coinage as king in Latin, and some of them as friend of Rome, which was a formal status with real benefits and a real price. Merchants from the continent settled in the trading ports. Roman diplomacy did what Roman diplomacy always did, which was to find the second son who felt overlooked and be his friend and be patient. And the kings, being human, kept swallowing each other. One dynasty in particular, based north of the great river in the corn country, spent those decades absorbing its neighbors, taking the rich lands of the coastal people to its east, pushing west and south, until under one long reigning king, whom Roman writers called the King of the Britons, it controlled the whole of the wealthiest corner of the island, from a sprawling, ditch-ringed, thoroughly prosperous capital in the east that we now call Colchester. He died, as successful men who have not settled the succession tend to, at the worst possible moment, leaving sons who were less careful than he had been, and a scattering of dispossessed rivals, and at least one exiled king with a grievance and a boat and a very clear idea of where to take his complaint. Meanwhile, in Rome, there was a new emperor who needed a war. He had come to the throne in an undignified fashion, the details of which do not matter tonight beyond the essential fact that he was not supposed to be emperor at all, that a good many important men said so loudly, and that in the Roman system, the fastest way to convert doubt into applause was a triumph. Britain fitted perfectly. It was famous. It was across the ocean, which to a Mediterranean audience meant beyond the edge of the world. It was rich, or was said to be, and a dispossessed friendly king was already in the city, asking, so the order was given, and 4 legions and roughly the same number again of auxiliary troops were gathered on the Gallic coast in the spring of the year 43, and there they stopped, because the soldiers refused to get on the ships. This is one of my favorite moments in the whole story, and it is not a heroic one. The finest military machine in the world, drawn up on a beach declining to embark, on the entirely reasonable grounds that they were being asked to sail off the edge of the map. The commander could not shift them. An imperial secretary, a freedman, was sent from Rome to talk them round. And the sight of a former slave climbing onto the platform to lecture the legions was so outrageous, so completely upside down, that the whole army fell about laughing and got on the boats out of sheer embarrassment. Empires have turned on stranger hinges. They crossed in 3 divisions, probably to the sheltered water and the great natural harbor of the southeast, and possibly also further west along the coast, and the landing was unopposed, because the local kings had heard about the mutiny, assumed the invasion was canceled, and gone home to get the harvest in. The first real fighting came at a river crossing, and it lasted 2 days, which for a Roman battle is close to unheard of. The Britons had drawn up on the far bank of a broad tidal river in the southeast, expecting the usual and opposed crossing at a ford with all the advantages to the defender. What they got instead was a unit of auxiliaries recruited from a people on the lower Rhine who trained specifically to swim rivers in full equipment, going into the water downstream, coming out on the wrong side, and going straight for the chariot ponies, kill the ponies, and the chariots are firewood. The line came apart from behind while it was still watching the front, and the legions came over, and the fighting went on all that day and all the next, which tells you the Britons did not break easily and were not the disorganized rabble of the later telling. They held it, and then they lost it, and they fell back to the next river and lost that too, and the road to the eastern capital was open. And here the emperor arrived in person, having waited in Gaul for exactly this message, and came up the road with reinforcements and famously with elephants. Nobody in the island had ever seen an elephant. It is difficult to think of a more efficient piece of political theater. The man whose legitimacy was in question walking into the enemy capital at the head of a column of animals from another world in a country beyond the ocean, 16 days after leaving Rome to accept the surrender of 11 kings. He stayed on the island about a fortnight, which was quite enough, went home, held his triumph, gave his small son a victory name, and left the actual conquest to men who would spend the rest of their careers on it. Because that is the thing about the year 43. The invasion was a summer. The conquest took 40 years, and in some corners it was never really finished at all. The pattern of those 40 years is worth understanding, because it repeats. A frontier is established, usually on a good line, a river, a road, a ridge. Behind it, roads are built and forts are planted a day's march apart, and treaties are signed with local rulers who agree to be friends and pay tax and keep their people quiet, and who, in exchange, keep their thrones, their wealth, and a flattering title. Then something happens. A friendly king dies without a clear heir, or a governor decides that the tribes over the hill are sheltering enemies, or trouble in the rear makes the whole line look soft. And the frontier moves forward, and a new set of forts goes in, and the same conversation begins again with the next set of neighbors. Within 4 years of the landing, the province ran roughly from the southeast up to the Humber and across to the estuary of the Severn, tied together by a great diagonal road that later got called the Fosse Way, and that ran, with characteristic Roman indifference to the scenery, in a nearly straight line across the whole width of the country. One southern king was rewarded with a client kingdom of extraordinary size on the south coast, and the palace eventually built in his territory, with its mosaic floors and its formal garden beds and its imported marble, is the single most eloquent piece of evidence we have that for some people at the top of British society, the arrival of Rome was not a catastrophe, but a promotion. In the southwest, the work was harder and was given to the commander of the 2nd Legion, a solid, unglamorous, slightly grubby officer from a family nobody had heard of, who would one day, through a chain of events that would have astonished everyone, including him, become emperor himself. He took, by the count of one Roman writer, more than 20 hill forts. It was not enough. It was almost never enough. Against artillery, engineering, and troops who did the same drill in the same order every single time, courage and a good hill were simply not the deciding factors anymore. And that is the quiet tragedy underneath the whole of the first generation. Not everyone accepted the new arrangement, and one man in particular refused to, and is long wandering. Doomed Campaign is the first great British story of the Roman centuries. He was a son of the old king of the Corn Country, one of the brothers who had inherited a kingdom and lost it in a single season. When the southeast fell, he did not surrender, and he did not die conveniently. He went west. He put himself at the service of the hill peoples of the Welsh valleys. the ones who had no intention of paying tax to anybody, and for something like 8 years, he made the western frontier an expensive place to be. He fought the war that suited his side and not theirs. Ambush, retreat, night attack, cattle taken, supply columns cut, forts built and then found to be untenable, governors recalled with their reputations dented, and their reports carefully worded. In the end, he made the one mistake that army was waiting for. He offered a set piece. He chose a good position, in the hills, with a river in front and a stone rampart built along a ridge, and he drew up his people where they could see him and hear him and be sure of what they were about to do, and he made the sort of speech that goes into the histories. This day, this ground. Freedom or the end of it. And then the legions came up the slope under a roof of shields, pulled the loose stone rampart apart with their hands, and it was over in an afternoon. His wife and daughter and brothers were taken. He himself got away north to the Queen of the Great Northern Federation, a shrewd woman running a difficult confederation who had made her own arrangement with Rome years before and had no appetite for wrecking it on behalf of a fugitive from the south. She put him in chains and handed him over. He was taken to Rome to be paraded, which normally meant being displayed in the triumph and then quietly killed in a cell afterwards. Instead, he was brought before the emperor and the Senate and given the chance to speak, and he did the only thing that could possibly have saved him, which was to be magnificently unembarrassed. He had horses and men and wealth of his own, he reminded them. Was it so strange that he had not wanted to lose them? And then the line that got him his life, if he had surrendered at once, neither his fall nor Rome's glory would have been worth remembering. The emperor pardoned him and his family on the spot. He lived out his years in the city on a pension, a famous man in a famous house. And the story goes that he looked around at the marble and the crowds and remarked that he could not understand why people who owned all this should want his little huts. While all that was happening in the West, the province behind the frontier was being built, and this is where the shape of the country you can still see today begins. First, the roads. Not tracks. Roads surveyed in long straight alignments from high point to high point, dug out to a firm base, packed with rubble and gravel, cambered so the water ran off, ditched on both sides, with milestones and posting stations and at intervals of about a day's march, a fort or a walled stop where an official traveler could get a bed, a meal, and a fresh horse. Watling Street running up from the southeastern ports through the New River crossing at London and away to the northwest. Ermine Street north to Lincoln and York. Roads to places that did not exist yet and would exist because the road did. Then the towns. Some grew where a fort had been and the army moved on, leaving behind the traders and the families and the bathhouse and the road junction, which is how a surprising number of English towns began, as the civilian smudge outside a military gate. Some were deliberately founded. The first great one was a colony of retired soldiers planted at the old eastern capital on the site of the surrendered king's stronghold, where veterans of the legions were given land, a house, a plot, and the standing of a Roman citizen in a Roman town, complete with a grid of streets, a forum, a theater, and an enormous temple. That temple deserves a moment, because it is the hinge of what happens next. When the emperor who had ridden in with the elephants died, he was declared a god, as emperors were, and the province built him a temple in the new colony, a great podium, tall columns, a cult with priesthoods that leading Britons were expected to hold and, crucially, to pay for. The men appointed found themselves funding festivals, sacrifices, games, and building works out of their own estates, and when their own estates ran short, out of borrowed money, because the money was available. And the money was available because Roman financiers had spotted a new province full of landowners with more status than cash. That is a modest, dull administrative sentence, and it is the fuse. Because at the same time, the army had gone west again. A new governor, an energetic and religiously minded man, had decided that the route of the Western resistance was the island off the coast of North Wales, the sacred island, the heart of the Druid teaching, the refuge of everyone who had ever fled the advance. So, in the year 60, he took the field army across the strait on flat-bottomed boats, with the cavalry swimming their horses beside them, and on the far shore he found the whole apparatus of a religion drawn up on the beach to meet him, armed men, and among them women in dark clothes with torches, and the priests with their hands raised, calling down whatever it is you call down at such a moment. The troops, by the honest admission of the Roman account, stopped dead. Then the officers got them moving again, and they went up the beach, and the groves were cut down. And while the entire mobile strength of the province stood on a beach at the far northwestern corner of Wales, 250 miles from the rich southeast, a client king in the flat eastern country died. He had been careful, that king. He ruled the people of the reedy east. He had been a friend of Rome since the landing. He had grown rich and stayed independent, and when he came to make his will, he tried to do the clever thing. He left his kingdom jointly to his 2 daughters and to the emperor, on the theory that nobody robs a man who has already made the emperor his heir. It did not work. It could not have worked, because a client kingdom was a personal arrangement with a living man, and when he died, the arrangement died, and the province simply annexed the territory. The financiers who had lent so freely called in their loans at the same time, in the way of financiers, all at once and at the worst moment. His household was treated as spoil. And when his widow, the queen, objected and kept objecting, the officials did to her and to her 2 daughters the sort of thing that garrison troops do when they have decided that a place is theirs and nobody is coming, and I am not going to describe it, and you can sleep through this bit with a clear conscience, because the point of it is not the horror. The point of it is that it was not even policy. It was a middle-ranking clerk with a detachment of soldiers humiliating a widow because there was no reason not to. There was a reason not to. The reason not to was that this was a martial society in which a royal house had obligations to its people, and its people had obligations back. And the neighboring peoples had been stripped of their weapons and their land and their patience for 17 years, and the entire field army was standing on a beach in Wales, and the queen was not, as the Romans had assumed, an ornament. The year that followed was the worst the province ever had, and it came on very fast. The queen of the eastern people raised her own and then rode south and west, and found that she did not have to persuade anybody. The coastal people whose land had been taken for the veterans' colony joined at once. Others came in from the fringes. The Roman writers, who wanted a monster and a marvel at the same time, describe her as very tall, with a great mass of red hair down to her hips, a harsh voice, a heavy gold torque at her throat, and a many-colored cloak fastened with a brooch standing up in a chariot to be seen. The first place they came to was the colony, the town of the veterans, the temple of the god emperor, the place where the confiscations had been administered. It had no walls. Nobody had thought it needed any. The town sent to the imperial agent in London for troops and was sent 200 men without proper equipment. The population held out in the great stone temple for 2 days, and then it was over, and the whole town was burned so thoroughly that beneath the modern high street there is still a layer of red-orange burnt clay and melted glass, 1.5 feet thick in places, that archaeologists simply call the destruction horizon. You can hold a piece of it in your hand. It is the color of a flower pot. The nearest legion, the 9th, came down the road from the northeast to relieve the town, and was caught on the march in country the Britons had chosen, and its infantry was destroyed. The commander got out with the cavalry, which tells you the infantry did not, and that legion never recovered its strength in the province and would spend the next 50 years being quietly written about in ways that suggest people had not forgotten. The governor, meanwhile, had heard the news on the far side of Wales and was doing arithmetic on horseback. He came down the road to London ahead of his army with a cavalry escort to see the situation for himself. What he found was a young, rich, entirely undefended trading city on the north bank of the great river. Warehouses, wharves, workshops, a bridge, a population of merchants and clerks and ship owners and their households, most of them from somewhere else. All of them very keen to be told that the army was staying. He did the arithmetic and told them it was not. He offered to take with him anybody who could keep up with the column, and he pulled out and left the city. The people who could travel went with him. The old, the reluctant, the ones who could not leave a business, the ones who simply did not believe it would come to that, stayed. The city was burned. There is a destruction layer under London, too. The same red clay, the same melted glass, and where a warehouse of imported pottery stood, the fire was hot enough to fuse the stacked bowls together in the shape they were stacked. The same thing happened a few days later at the town further northwest along the road, another undefended place of shops and workshops. 3 towns in one summer gone. The Roman figure for the dead in the whole rising is 70,000, and Roman figures are usually theater, and even a heavily discounted version of it is a catastrophe on a scale the island had never seen. And then it turned the way these things do on logistics and ground. The governor gathered what he had, which was 1 legion and part of another, and some auxiliaries, about 10,000 men in total, against a British host that the sources put at many times that number, and which had grown into something that was no longer only an army. It had brought the wives and children along to watch and parked the wagons in a great arc at the back of the field, which is a decision that makes perfect sense if you believe the war is already won, and is catastrophic if it is not. He picked his ground with enormous care, a narrow place with a wood at his back so nobody could get behind him, and steep ground on both flanks so that all that weight of numbers could only come at him through a gap no wider than his own line. It was the whole Roman art in one choice: make the battle small enough to be won by discipline instead of numbers. They came up the slope and were met by 2 volleys of heavy javelins, and then by a wedge of armored infantry moving downhill at a walk, and the front rank went back into the ranks behind it, and the weight of their own crowd meant there was nowhere to go. And behind them was the arc of wagons, and the wagons meant there was nowhere to go from there either. It lasted a long afternoon, and it was not a battle by the end of it. The queen died soon after, by poison or by illness, depending on which account you follow, and was buried somewhere nobody has ever found, and the rising was finished. What came afterwards is, in its way, the more revealing part. The Roman reprisals through the eastern country were so thorough and so heavy on the harvest that famine did more killing than the fighting had. The governor kept burning until an imperial financial official, a man sent to look after revenue rather than honor, wrote home to point out that a scorched province pays no tax and that the governor's temper was costing the treasury money. The governor was recalled on a pretext with honor and replaced by mild men with instructions to be reasonable. The province was rebuilt. The temple was rebuilt too, and eventually the towns got walls. And here is the thing that always stops me. Within one lifetime of that summer, in the same eastern country, people were living in rectangular houses with tiled roofs and painted plaster, buying oil lamps and glass beakers, eating off factory-made pottery from Gaul, using Roman coins for small, everyday things, and writing their names in Latin on their kitchen goods. Not because they had forgotten. The grandmothers remembered perfectly well. But because a province is not a mood. It is a set of arrangements about tax and land and law and money, and once the arrangements are in place, the ordinary business of getting through a life runs along them the way water runs along a ditch. So the province settled and turned its attention north. The next 20 years are the great age of Roman advance in Britain, and they belong mostly to one man, largely because his son-in-law happened to be the finest historian of the age and wrote him a glowing biography, which is the single best career move available to anyone in the ancient world. He had served in the island twice before, as a junior officer during the Rising and later as a legionary commander, so he arrived as governor knowing the ground and the people, and, more importantly, knowing what had gone wrong last time. He finished Wales in a single season, including a return to the sacred island, this time crossed by auxiliaries who swam it without boats and arrived on the far shore so unexpectedly that the defenders assumed anyone who could do that could probably do anything. Then he turned north into the country of the Great Federation, whose queen had by then been deposed by her own former husband and whose kingdom had come apart along exactly the lines Rome had spent 30 years widening. He went north in stages, and he went north the Roman way, which is to say that the campaign was mostly building. Every night, a marching camp, ditch, bank, palisade, tents in the standard pattern, gates in the standard places. And in the morning, it is filled in and abandoned, and there is another one 20 miles further on. You can still see them from the air, faint rectangles in barley fields, the whole route of an advance laid out as a dotted line across the map of Scotland, like the footprints of something very large and very methodical. He got a long way, further than anyone before or after. The fleet went with him up the east coast, mapping harbors, and at some point in those years it did something nobody had done. It sailed right round the top of the island and back down the other side, proving conclusively that Britain was an island which people had suspected and now knew. The far north came to a head in a battle at a place the histories call Mons Graupius. High in the northeast, where the northern peoples had finally gathered into tens of thousands under a leader whose name survives as Calgacus. His pre-battle speech, as recorded, is one of the most quoted passages in Roman literature, and was, of course, entirely written by a Roman senator sitting in a study in Italy who had never met him. They make it desolation and call it peace. History is full of this. The battle went as they went. The auxiliaries did the work, the legions barely engaged, the northern host broke, and the survivors went up into the glens where they could not be followed profitably. And the governor built a great fortress at the mouth of the Highland passes, a legionary base of stone and timber laid out for 6,000 men. And it was very nearly finished when the order came from Rome that troops were needed on the Danube, and the whole northern project was abandoned. The way it was abandoned is one of my favorite small facts in Roman Britain. They pulled the buildings down, they smashed the pottery so it could not be used, they cut the timbers, and they took up the nails, and because there were far too many nails to carry, and because leaving good iron to be found by people you have just fought is how you arm your enemy. They dug an enormous pit in the floor of a workshop, threw in about 1,000,000 iron nails weighing something like 10 tons, covered it over, tamped it down, and marched away. It lay there, undisturbed, in a field in Perthshire for 1,860 years. When it was finally excavated, the nails in the middle of the mass were still bright. It is worth stopping the story here for a while before we go back down the country and looking properly at the machine that did all this, because everything that follows for the next 3 centuries is shaped by it, and because it is genuinely one of the most interesting organizations any human beings have ever built. A legion, on paper, was about 5,000 men. Citizens, volunteers, enlisted for 25 years, which in a world where a man might reasonably expect 50 or 60 is most of an adult life. They were organized in centuries of 80, not 100, because the Roman army had at some point in the distant past changed the number and, in the way of institutions everywhere, had not changed the name. 6 centuries made a cohort. 10 cohorts made a legion, with the first cohort double strength and made of the best men, plus a small cavalry detachment for scouting and messages, plus a body of specialists, plus the artillery. The centurion commanded the century, and the centurion is the whole story. Promoted from the ranks in his 30s or 40s, carrying a twisted vine stick as his badge of office and using it liberally, he was the man who made everything actually happen. A tribune might be 24 years old and on his way to a political career. His centurions had been fighting on frontiers since before he was born. Below them were the ordinary soldiers, and their life was work. Actual fighting was rare. Most days were parade, inspection, weapons drill with a wooden sword against a post twice a day, route marches in full kit, guard duty, fatigues, and building. Endless building. The Roman soldier was an infantryman who happened to be a professional laborer, surveyor, carpenter, quarryman, and mason, and it is quite likely that the average legionary in Britain spent 100 days building for every 1 day fighting. His kit was famous, and it was heavy. A mail shirt, or in the great days, a cuirass of overlapping iron strips fastened with buckles and leather straps, which is flexible and strong and which requires either 2 spare minutes or a friend to get into. 2 heavy javelins designed so the long, soft iron shank bent on impact and could not be thrown back, and which, even when it only hit a shield, made that shield impossible to hold. A dagger. And then the marching load, a yoke with a bag, a cloak, a cooking pot, a mess tin, a hand mill shared between the tent group, rations for several days, 2 stakes for the camp palisade, a spade or a turf cutter or a basket, 60 pounds and upwards, 20 miles a day, and then dig the camp. That is the part people forget when they wonder how the empire happened. It was not that the individual Roman soldier was a better fighter than the individual Briton or German. Very often he was not. It was that at the end of 20 miles, the Roman army built a fortified camp before it ate every single night in the same layout so that a man woken in the dark knew instantly which way to run and where his officer would be standing. Predictability, repeated for centuries, at scale, is a superpower. They were paid in coin 3 times a year, with deductions taken off at source for food, boots, socks, bedding, the burial club, and the unit savings bank, which is a system so recognizable it is almost painful. But there were bonuses on the accession of an emperor, and a share of plunder, and, at the end, either a plot of land or a discharge payment large enough to set a man up as a modest landowner, and citizenship for the auxiliaries. A poor man's son from Spain or Thrace could sign away 25 years and, if he lived, come out the other end a citizen with capital. And his children would be citizens by birth. That is an extraordinary offer to make in the ancient world, and it is the reason the recruiting officers never went short. And they had a religion of the unit. The eagle of the legion was the legion. There was a calendar of festivals, the same in every fort of the empire, on which the appropriate sacrifices were made to the appropriate gods, and the appropriate parade was held. And the whole thing was written down and observed with the punctilious attention of an organization that believed, quite sincerely, that its extraordinary luck was a contract with heaven, and that the contract had terms. Around the army sat the other half of the machine, which was the supply system, and this is the part that never gets a statue. To keep 3 legions and perhaps 30,000 auxiliaries in Britain, the state had to move grain, wine, oil, meat, salt, leather, iron, timber, and pay every year across an ocean and up a country on schedule in weather. The whole apparatus was run by clerks, and the clerks kept records, and it is those records on wooden slivers in the mud of a fort that let us stand at a man's shoulder 18 centuries later and read that on a particular day there were 752 men in the unit, of whom 31 were unfit for duty, and that 6 of them had sore eyes. 6 men with sore eyes on a wet morning at the top of the world. I think about them more than I think about the eagles. And there is one more thing to say about this army before we let it march back down the country, which is that it was, in the long run, the most powerful engine of change in the province. And not because of the fighting. It was the biggest employer, the biggest customer, the biggest builder, and the biggest single reason coin circulated. It bought local grain, local leather, local pots, local beer, local everything, and the farms near the frontier reorganized themselves around selling to it. It carried the calendar, the gods, the bathhouse, and a straight line to places that had never had any of them. That is the machine that had come up the country in a single lifetime and was now, on the order of a man 2,000 miles away who had never seen it, going to come back down again and stop. So the high water mark receded, and the army came back down the country to a line it could actually hold, and for the next 30-odd years the northern frontier drifted about between the rivers, held by a road with forts on it running from one coast to the other across the narrow neck of the island. There was fighting we know almost nothing about, because the historians of the age were busy with the Danube and the East, and Britain slipped out of the narrative for a while, the way a difficult, expensive, distant department slips out of the minutes when it is merely difficult and expensive and not actually on fire. Then, in the year 122, the emperor came in person, and the frontier stopped drifting. He is one of the more interesting men ever to hold the office. Restless, clever, sharp-tongued, an amateur architect who was not remotely an amateur, a traveler who spent more of his reign on the road than in Rome, and, crucially for us, an emperor who had decided that the empire had grown as much as it was going to grow. His predecessor had expanded east, and it had not gone well. His policy was consolidation. Fix the edges, mark them, hold them, stop bleeding legions into places that could not be governed profitably. And in the wet north of Britain, he built the largest and most complete of the lot, and it is still there. The idea is simple, and the execution is not. A wall across the country, from the tidal river in the east to the estuary in the west, about 80 Roman miles, which is roughly 73 of ours. Stone for most of it, turf for the western end at first, later replaced in stone. 15 feet high or so, with a walkway on top. In front of it, a deep ditch, cut even through solid rock where the ground refused to cooperate, and in one stretch you can still see the abandoned, half-quarried section where the engineers reached a bed of whinstone and, after a certain amount of effort, apparently decided that the cliff behind it was doing the job well enough on its own. Along the wall, every Roman mile, a small, gated fortlet with barracks for a handful of men, and between each pair of those, 2 turrets for watching. So a signal could go from any point on that line to the men who could do something about it in a very short time indeed. Later, 16 or so full forts were built astride the wall itself, each holding 500 to 1,000 auxiliary troops, cavalry and infantry, with granaries raised on little stone pillars so the air could move under the floor and the grain would keep. Headquarters buildings with a shrine for the standards and a strong room under it for the pay. Commanding officers' houses with underfloor heating and courtyards, hospitals, workshops, latrines flushed by a running channel, and bathhouses, because a Roman soldier at the age of the world was not going to go without a hot room, a warm room, and a cold plunge, and would have regarded any suggestion that he might as evidence of moral collapse. It took something like 6 years, and it was built by the legions themselves, not by slaves and not by locals, by professional soldiers who were also professional builders working in gangs, each detachment responsible for a stretch, cutting their unit's name into a stone at the end of their length in the manner of workmen everywhere who want it on record that this bit is theirs, and that the sagging bit further along is not. Those centurial stones are still in the wall. So are the marks of the tools. So, at one quarry is a piece of graffiti carved by a soldier who was clearly having a long week and wanted somebody someday to know it. Now, what was it for? The honest answer is that it was for several things at once, and the Roman writer who mentions it says only that it was to separate the Romans from the barbarians, which is a sentence with a great deal of politics in it and very little engineering. It was not a wall to stand on and fight from. Mostly what it could do, superbly, was control movement. It stopped small-scale raiding, which was the actual chronic problem, cattle theft, hit and run, groups of a few dozen slipping south, doing damage, and getting home before anyone could react. Against that, a continuous barrier with a ditch and watchers is very nearly perfect, because you can get over a wall, but you cannot get a herd of stolen cattle back over one, and a raid that cannot bring the cattle home is not a raid, it is a long walk. And it taxed. Every gate was a place where goods were counted, and duty was paid, and people were looked at. Trade did not stop at the wall. Trade went through the wall under supervision at the empire's convenience in both directions, with the northern peoples selling hides and cattle and buying pottery and metalwork and no doubt complaining about the paperwork. And it announced. Imagine it new, not the weathered gray line you see on a photograph, but freshly built, the stone-faced and pointed, and quite possibly the whole thing whitewashed, so that on a clear day it ran across the hills and dales like a chalk line drawn on the country by somebody with a very long ruler. To a farmer on the northern side, that was not a defensive structure. It was a sentence. It said, "This is where we have decided to stop, and we did this in 6 years, and if we chose to come further, we could." Then the emperor died, and his successor promptly threw the whole policy out. The new man had never campaigned in his life, needed a victory to establish himself, and had a compliant senate and a quiet empire. So he ordered the army in Britain to advance 100 miles north and build another wall across the narrow waste of Scotland. And they did. In turf, on a stone base with a huge ditch and forts every 2 miles, and it was finished in about 12 years and held for about 20 and was then given up. And then it was reoccupied, briefly. And then it was given up again for good, and the garrison came back down to the first wall, and the first wall stayed the frontier for the rest of the story. We know an extraordinary amount about the ordinary life of that frontier, and we know it because of an accident. Just south of the wall, at a fort that had already been there for a generation before the wall existed, the ground is waterlogged. The soldiers rebuilt their fort every few years, as timber forts must be rebuilt, and each time they did, they flattened the old buildings, laid down turf and clay, and built on top. The result is a stack of floors sealed under wet clay with no oxygen in it, and where there is no oxygen there is nothing to rot the leather, the wood, the textiles, or, and this is the miracle, the writing. They wrote on wood, not carved, written in ink, with a pen, on slivers of birch and alder shaved thin as a postcard, folded and tied and sent about. Hundreds of them survive. Not literature, the paperwork of a frontier garrison. Duty rosters, requests for leave, accounts for barley, wine, vinegar, pork fat and sour beer, a letter about a consignment of oysters, and then, among the ledgers, a birthday invitation. The wife of the commander of a nearby fort writes to the wife of the commander here, inviting her to come for her birthday, and adds a line in her own hand at the bottom, in a different pen, in a slightly less practiced script than the secretary's, telling her friend how much she wants her to come. It is the earliest known writing in Latin by a woman's own hand, and it was found in the mud of a fort at the edge of the empire, in a bundle of accounts about beer. And it has nothing in it at all except one woman's ordinary affection for another. 1,800 years later, in a wet field in Northumberland, somebody lifted it out of the clay with a trowel. Who were they, the men on that wall? Almost none of them were Italian, and hardly any of them were British at first, and after a few generations, a great many of them were both British and something else entirely. The legions were the citizen heavy infantry, and there were 3 of them in the province for most of its history, based at the great fortresses in the west, the northeast, and the middle west of the country, at places we now call Caerleon, York, and Chester. But the men actually standing on the frontier, day in and day out, were auxiliaries, units raised from peoples all over the empire, serving 25 years, at the end of which they and their families were granted citizenship, recorded on a small folding bronze diploma that they kept for the rest of their lives, because it was the deed to their family's whole future. So on that wall, in the wind, you had cohorts from what is now Belgium and the Netherlands, from Spain, from the Rhineland, from the Balkans. There was a unit of archers from Syria at one fort with their composite bows and their conical helmets, which must have been a startling sight in a Northumbrian sleet. And there were, in time, an enormous number of local recruits, because a garrison that stays in one place for 200 years stops being foreign. That is the part that surprises people. It was a long, strung-out, thoroughly permanent society. Outside every fort gate a civilian settlement grew, and it grew with the fort and died with it. Shops, workshops, taverns, a bathhouse. Traders, shrines, and families, because although soldiers below the rank of centurion were not legally permitted to marry until late in our period, everybody knew that the law and the arrangement were two different things. And the arrangement was that a man had a woman and children living in the settlement outside the gate, and when he was discharged, he married her formally, legitimized the children, and took the small plot of land or the pension, and quite often did not go anywhere at all, because his life was here now, and his children spoke the local dialect, and his wife's family farmed up the valley. Their gods came with them, and this is where the frontier gets genuinely lovely. Roman religion was not exclusive. If the local people had a god of a spring or a hill, then that god was real, and the sensible thing was to identify him with whichever Roman god he most resembled and worship both at once, under a hyphenated name with an altar that hedges every possible bet. You find altars to gods from the Rhineland and the Danube, brought north by units that had brought their home with them. You find altars to purely British gods with names nobody can pronounce, set up by officers with careful Latin. And underground, in windowless little temples with benches down each side, you find the cave shrines of the soldier's mystery, cult from the East, with its bull and its torchbearers and its grades of initiation and its total silence about what actually went on in there. Which, of course, is why we are all still so interested. And you find, in the middle of all that, the small human wreckage that religion leaves. Tombstones. A cavalryman shown riding down an enemy aged 20 years service set up by his heirs. A freed woman from the South, dead at 33, whose husband and former master describes her on the stone as a most faithful wife, and whose name and origin he records with great care because she was from a long way away and he wanted the stone to say so. A child of 4 remembered with a lamp. A standard bearer whose comrades clubbed together. They are not different from the tombstones in any modern churchyard except in their spelling, and they are the reason that walking the wall in the rain with a cup of something hot is such an oddly emotional way to spend a day. Meanwhile, far to the south, the province was becoming something the men of the year 43 would not have recognized at all. Consider a town, not the frontier settlements, a proper civitas capital, the administrative center of what had been a tribal territory and was now a district with a council. At the center, where the 2 main streets cross, there is a forum, a large open gravelled square surrounded by a covered colonnade with shops and offices along 3 sides, and along the 4th an enormous isled hall, the Basilica, which is the town hall and the law court, and the record office, and a place where the council meets, and a place where you go to shout at somebody about a boundary. Around that, the ordinary machinery of civilized life, most of which the island had never had. Public baths heated by furnaces under the floors, with a changing room, a warm room, a hot room, a plunge, and the whole social apparatus of a place where you go every afternoon to get clean, be seen, do business, hear gossip, and be scraped down with a curved bronze tool by somebody who does it for a living. In the larger towns, a theater, and in several, an amphitheater outside the walls, oval, banked with earth, for beast shows and fights and the sort of civic occasion where the point is that the whole district sees the whole district. And shops. If you were dropped into the main street of one of those towns on a market morning, the thing that would strike you is not the marble. It is the noise and the smell, and how much of it you would recognize. Who lived there? Everybody. Which is to say a great many people who would have described themselves in very different ways. Merchants and shippers, many of them from Gaul and the Rhineland. Craftsmen, some free, some freed, some enslaved. Imperial officials with their staff. Retired soldiers. Priests, and an enormous, largely invisible population of the enslaved, because this was a slave society at every level, and the pleasant villa with the mosaic and the underfloor heating was pleasant partly because somebody was underneath it in the dark feeding the furnace all night. In the winter, and their name is not on anything. Who ran all that and how is worth a short detour, because the machinery of Roman government is much stranger than people expect and much lighter than they assume. At the top of the province sat the governor, a senator of consular rank, appointed for 3 or 4 years, who was simultaneously the commander of the army, the chief judge and the head of the civil administration, and who travailed constantly. Beside him, and deliberately not under him, sat the procurator, the emperor's own financial officer, who ran the taxes, the mines, the imperial estates, and the pay of the troops, and who reported separately to the emperor. Underneath them, astonishingly little. No police force, no professional civil service reaching down into the districts, no inspectors. The empire governed a province of perhaps 2 or 3 million people with a central establishment you could fit into a large house, and it did it by delegating everything downward to the local aristocracy and then holding them personally responsible for the results. That is what the town councils were for. Each district had one, made up of 100 or so of the wealthiest local landowners holding office for life, electing magistrates from among themselves each year. They assessed and collected the taxes of their district and were personally liable for the shortfall. They paid out of their own pockets for the games, the festivals, the repairs, and, quite often, for whole public buildings, and in return their names were carved on those buildings in letters a foot high, which was the currency they actually cared about. For the first 2 centuries, that arrangement worked because status was worth buying. By the 4th, when taxes had risen and the personal liability had become genuinely frightening, membership of the council changed from an honor into a trap, and the law had to be repeatedly rewritten to stop men escaping it by joining the army, the church, or the imperial service. When you read late Roman legislation forbidding counselors to become priests, you are watching a system slowly seizing up, and it is the single best indicator we have that the good years were ending. Law itself was formal, slow, written, and available in a way it had never been before. It was not equal, but it was written down, and it was public. And it was the same next year as it had been last year, and that is a genuine gift to a farmer who wants to know whether the field is his. Outside the walls, though, is where nearly everybody actually was. The province was overwhelmingly rural, and it stayed that way from the first day to the last. Perhaps 1 person in 10 lived in a town of any size. The rest were on the land, and the land is where the real story of the middle centuries sits. At the top of the rural world sat the villa, and the word is misleading because it conjures a holiday house. A villa was a farm. The earliest ones, in the generation after the conquest, are modest. A rectangular timber building of 5 or 6 rooms with a veranda along the front, which is essentially the old roundhouse tradition wearing a rectangle, because rectangles are now what respectable people live in. Then a wing gets added, then a bath suite, because a landowner who cannot offer a guest a hot bath is going to hear about it. Then a corridor to connect the rooms, so you stop walking through your own dining room. Then a second story, tiled roofs, painted plaster, window glass, which the island had never had and which changes everything about what a winter afternoon indoors feels like. Then, mosaics. By the good years, some of these places are extraordinary. Underfloor heating in the main rooms, the hot air from a furnace outside running under a floor propped on little stacks of tiles, and then up flues inside the walls, so the wall itself is warm to lean on. Gardens, fish ponds, granaries, threshing floors, drying kilns, a smithy, cattle sheds, workers' quarters, a shrine. But that is the top slice. Below it, most of the countryside carried on in ways that would have looked familiar to a farmer of 2 centuries before the invasion, except for the details. Round houses, still in enormous numbers, well into the 3rd and 4th centuries, in the west and the north, and even in parts of the rich south. The same fields deepened, the same cattle. What changed was what came in and out of the farm gate. Now there was coin in small denominations for small transactions, which sounds trivial and is the single greatest social change of the whole period, because the moment ordinary people are handling small change, they are inside a market economy, and once you are inside a market economy, you are, in the deepest sense, inside the empire. Whatever you happen to be wearing. And there was tax, always tax. That is the load-bearing beam under everything else. The province was assessed, its land measured, its households counted, and the tax was collected, in coin and in kind, and it went to pay the army, and the army spent it locally, and the spending of it drove the market that made the coin useful. Industry got organized on a scale the island had never seen. Lead and silver came out of the western hills within 6 years of the invasion, so fast that lead ingots stamped with the emperor's name, and a date turn up almost before the ink is dry on the conquest, which tells you exactly what the conquest was for. Pottery went from a village craft to a business, with whole districts making one product for the whole province and shipping it down the roads and rivers. And it all moved on those roads and on the rivers and along the coast in small ships. And the coast is a point worth making, because we tend to see Roman Britain as a road map, when it was actually a harbor map. A person of moderate means in a small British town in the 2nd century could season their dinner with a sauce made from fermented fish in a Spanish coastal town, drink Gaulish wine from a Rhineland glass, eat off a bowl made in central France, and pay for the lot with a coin struck in Rome. That was the empire. Not the marble, the supply chain. Which brings us to how they thought about all of it, and here the province is at its most charming and its most strange. If you want to stand in one place and understand religion in Roman Britain, stand in the West Country, in the valley where the hot spring comes up out of the ground. There was a goddess there, The Romans arrived, looked at it, and did the thing they always did. They identified her with their own goddess of wisdom and crafts, gave her a double name that honored both, and then built around the spring one of the most remarkable religious complexes in the northwestern empire, with a great vaulted hall over the water. A temple with a carved Gorgon face on its pediment that is neither Roman nor British, but something the local sculptors made up on the spot, and baths where you could take the waters, and an altar where you could sacrifice and priests, and a constant traffic of pilgrims from all over the province and beyond. And into that steaming pool, over the centuries, people threw things. Coins by the thousand, jewelry, and most wonderfully, curses, small sheets of lead and pewter, hammered thin, on which a person scratched their complaint to the goddess, rolled it up, and dropped it in the water. Something like 130 of them have been recovered, and they are the most human documents in Roman Britain, because almost every single one is about petty theft. Someone has taken a cloak from the bathhouse. Someone has stolen 6 coins from a purse. And then they ask the goddess to deal with it, usually by denying the thief sleep, health, and the ability to eat or drink until the item is returned to the temple. I find those tablets more moving than any temple, because they are the sound of people who have had a small bad day standing by hot water, asking the universe for help with something trivial and being absolutely certain that the request is reasonable. Which it is. Let us travel for a while, because the province is best understood from a road, and because there is nothing more restful than a long journey somebody else is taking. Begin at the northern wall on an early autumn morning at one of the great gates, with the mist lying in the dips and the sun not yet over the ridge. A trader is waiting to be let through with a string of ponies and a load of hides. A cavalry patrol has just come back in, and the horses are steaming. And at the fort gate, an official is having his warrant checked, because he is traveling on the imperial post, and the paperwork is the whole point. So we go south from the wall on the Great Eastern Road, and the first thing to notice is that the road is aggressively straight in long segments from one siding point to the next, and that it goes over things rather than round them, where going over is only slightly harder. The surface is cambered, ditched on both sides, and made in layers, large stones at the bottom, then rubble. Then gravel rolled hard, and in the wet places a raft of timber or brushwood underneath, so the whole thing floats on the bog rather than sinking into it. There are milestones, cylindrical, with the emperor's name and titles carved on them in full, and the distance to the next town, and they were recarved and reused as emperors changed. So a milestone can carry 3 reigns like the layers of a cake. The traffic thickens as you go south. Carts of lead ingots from the western hills, each stamped with the emperor's name, on their way to a port. Cattle on the hoof, moving at their own speed and holding everyone up. A tax convoy with an escort moving grain toward the north, which is a great current of the province, food going up. Goods coming down, silver going round. You pass the fortress city on the river in the northeast, where a legion sits, and a great civilian town has grown across the water from it, quays, warehouses, a bridge, temples, the governor's residence when he is in the north, and eventually a colony with its own council and its own aristocracy. Ships come up on the tide from the sea. South again, and the country changes into cornland, enclosed fields, farmsteads, and then the first of the great estates, with their long tiled roofs visible from the road across the flat. And on down, through the Midlands, past crossroad settlements that exist entirely because two roads meet and people need a bed and a drink and somewhere to change a wheel. Then the great river and a city. London was not a British town. It was created, apparently from nothing, within a few years of the invasion, at the first point going up the estuary, where the ground was firm on both sides and the river was still tidal and could be bridged. That combination made it instantly the place where the sea met the road, and everything followed from that. It was burned in the rising and rebuilt bigger. It became the seat of the governor and the financial administration, and later of the mint. Stand on that bridge in the 2nd century. Downstream, the river is wide and gray and full of ships. Seagoing traders from Gaul and the Rhine, coastal vessels, lighters, and the flat barges that carry bulk up the smaller rivers inland. Somewhere in that crowd, a clerk is writing an address label on a wooden tablet, and somebody else is promising in writing to repay a debt, and both of those documents are going to be dropped in the wet ground and found. And then, in time, you would leave the city by the western gate on the road that runs toward the hot spring and the western hills. Past the cemeteries with their tombs along both sides, past the market gardens and the potteries and the tileries that clustered outside every big town because of the smoke and the smell, and out into the fields where the great majority of everybody lived, and where the only sound is the wind in a wheat crop and somebody a long way off calling to a dog. That is the province seen from the road. Now let us stop traveling and stand still in it. So let us slow right down for a while and simply live in the middle of it, in the 2nd century, in the long, calm stretch when nothing much happened. Which is the best thing that can be said about any century and the reason nobody writes books about them. Wake in a small town in the South, in an ordinary house, not a villa, not a hovel, a strip building on the main street with a workshop at the front. The room is dim because the window is small, and the glass, if there is glass, is greenish and full of bubbles and lets in light without letting in a view. It is cold because the fire went out and somebody is already blowing it back up out of last night's embers, feeding it dry twigs, then split wood, and the smoke is going up and hanging under the roof, and the smell of it is the smell the whole town wakes up to. Breakfast is bread and perhaps a little cheese and watered wine or small beer. The bread is dense, made of wheat ground at a mill by the river, or at home on a small stone quern by somebody who has done it 1,000 times and can do it while thinking about something else. It contains grit from the millstone, which is why the teeth of skeletons from this period are worn flat by middle age. There is nothing to be done about that, and nobody thought there was. Clothes are wool, and more wool, with linen underneath for those who can manage it. A tunic to the knee for a man, longer for a woman, belted, with a cloak over the top, pinned at the shoulder with a brooch, and in this country the cloak is the important garment, and there is a hood on it. In winter you put on more layers of the same thing. In summer you take some off. That is the entire wardrobe technology of the age, and it worked for 400 years. The day is work. If the household is a workshop, then the shutters come down and the counter is open to the street. If the household farms, then everything is the season, plowing in the autumn with a pair of oxen and a heavy iron share, sowing by hand, weeding, watching the sky with the particular anxiety of a person whose whole year is standing outdoors getting rained on. Food, if you are wondering, was better than you would think. Bread, porridge, beans, peas, lentils, cabbage, leeks, onions, garlic, carrots and turnips, apples, plums, cherries, which the Romans introduced along with walnuts and grapes and figs, and a startling range of herbs. Pork, mutton, beef, and enormous quantities of oysters, which were cheap, which were shipped inland, packed in wet straw, and whose shells lie in middens hundreds of miles from the sea. Honey, which was the only sweetener there was. Fish sauce on everything, or on everything if you had the taste for it, and the archaeological evidence suggests a lot of people did. Health was a lottery played with loaded dice. If you survived childhood, you might very reasonably expect your 50s or 60s. Doctors existed with a kit of bronze instruments that look uncomfortably like modern ones, scalpels, probes, forceps, and a folding case of little compartments for eye salves. Surgery happened and sometimes worked. Everything else was herbs, diet, prayer, and the sensible ancient conviction that a hot bath, a long walk, and less rich food would help, which, to be fair, it usually does. And death was public and orderly, which is the part that most differs from now. The dead were not allowed inside the town. Burial was outside the walls, along the roads, so that every approach to every town was lined with tombs, and the traveler coming in passed the district's ancestors on both sides for the last half-mile. In the early period, most people were cremated, the ashes put in a pot or a glass jar with a coin, a lamp, a plate of food, a favorite thing. Later, the fashion turned to burial in a coffin, laid out east to west, and in one cemetery in the north there are gypsum burials, where the body was packed in liquid plaster that set and preserved in negative. The shape of a woman with a child in her arms and the exact texture of the cloth they were wrapped in. The language of all this was 2 languages, or 3. Latin was the language of the army, the law, the market, the inscription, and the tax return, and it was spoken across the province in a plain, practical, provincial form. British was the language of the fields and the kitchen and the fireside, and it never stopped being spoken by most people, and it survived, and it grew into Welsh and Cornish and Breton, and, if you have ever heard Welsh spoken, you have heard, in a changed and living form, the language that the queen with the red hair used. And in the towns, quite a lot of people were functionally bilingual and wrote in the one and dreamed in the other, which is a good place to say what this province actually was, in the middle of its life. It was not Italy with rain. It was a hybrid, and the hybrid was the point. British aristocrats with Roman names running councils in towns their great-grandfathers had founded as hill forts. Gods with 2 names, soldiers from the Rhine married to women from the Tyne. A market where the pottery is local, the oil is Spanish, the coin is imperial, and the argument is being conducted in 2 languages at once. It ran, and it worked, and generation after generation of people were born into it and died in it and never once thought of themselves as living in a chapter of anybody's history. And they measured that life out with a year, which is the last thing I want to give you before the story starts moving again, because a year is a comfortable shape to fall asleep inside. Start it where they started it, in the deep of the winter. The old year is at its lowest, the light is thin, the ground is iron in the morning and mud by noon, and the great festival of the season is in full swing. For several days around the shortest days, the ordinary rules were suspended, work stopped, courts closed, houses were decorated with greenery, everyone wore soft caps and comfortable clothes instead of formal dress, small presents were exchanged, and the enslaved of a household were served dinner by the family, which was a temporary and entirely symbolic reversal that changed nothing at all and was, nonetheless, looked forward to all year. Then the new year opened. with vows for the health of the emperor and a state taken publicly on the 3rd day of January in every fort of the empire, and the first business transactions of the year done for luck, and the roads still bad. Late winter is the mending season, plows repaired, harness stitched, thatch patched, tools rehafted, baskets woven, wool spun and spun and spun. This is the hungry corner of the year before anything grows, when last year's grain has to stretch and everyone is counting. In the towns, it is the season of indoor work and long evenings by a lamp with a wick that needs trimming. Then, the ground softens and the spring plowing and sowing begin, and the great agricultural festivals come one after another. The purification of the fields, in which a procession walked the boundary of the land with the sacrificial animals, a pig, a sheep, and a bull, going round the whole property before they were offered, so that the good order of the farm was formally re-established for another year. Spring is also when the sea opens. The Mediterranean sailing season began in earnest around March, and everything else followed from that. The wine came, the oil came, the mail came, the officials came, the orders came. Then the campaigning season opened too, and if there was to be trouble on the frontier, it would begin now, because armies in the north move when there is grass for the horses. Summer is the long stretch of work, haymaking, then the enormous, everything else stops effort of the harvest, then threshing. The great markets and fairs fell in the good weather, and so did the games in the amphitheaters, and so did the big religious festivals in the towns, where a procession would carry the images out of the temple and round the streets with music. And the district would eat outside for a day. And autumn brings the slaughtering, the salting, the smoking, the pressing of whatever there was to press, the last of the fruit, the sowing of the winter wheat, and then the shutting down. The sea closes, the roads worsen, the army settles into winter quarters, the shutters go up, the wood is stacked. And the whole province turns inward for the dark months and starts eating what it spent the summer putting away. On the frontier, the year has the same shape with a colder edge on it. Winter on the wall meant short days of gray light, sleet coming sideways, the ground frozen or the ground liquid and nothing in between, and guard duty regardless. It meant the bathhouse being the most important building in the world. There is a note among the frontier documents in which a man asks a friend to send him warm things, and it does not need any commentary at all. And through all of it, at intervals, the festivals of the army calendar, the birthdays of good emperors, the days of the standards. The parade in the spring, when the cavalry showed off in ornamental helmets with face masks, riding patterns at speed in front of the whole garrison and their families and the settlement outside the gate. One of those helmets was found in a field in the north of England, a bronze face with curled hair and calm blank eyes. And it is the strangest and most beautiful object to come out of Roman Britain, a man's face, made to be worn by a man, so that for one afternoon a year he was not a man at all, but a figure out of a story. There were also the private rhythms that never appear on any calendar, the birth of a child and the naming of it on the 8th or 9th day, with a small amulet hung round its neck to keep off bad luck, and the whole household holding its breath for the first 2 years, because that was where the danger was, and the funerals along the roads, and the annual dinners for the dead in February, when families went out to the tombs and ate there, and poured a little of the wine into a pipe set into the grave so that the person in it could have their share, because it would have been rude not to. I like that last custom more than almost anything else in the period. Once a year, on a cold February day, You take the food out to the cemetery on the road outside the town, and you sit down by the stone with the rest of the family, and you eat lunch with your grandmother, and you tell her the news. Then you go home. And the next February, you do it again. And after enough Februaries there is nobody left who knew her. And somebody else's family is sitting there instead, and the stone falls over, and the road is still the road. That was the year. And the same year came round again, and again, and again, for a very long time, quietly, for people whose names we do not have. It did not stay quiet, of course. Nothing does. And the trouble, when it came in the way. Trouble usually comes to a province, from the outside only occasionally, and from the empire's own politics constantly. Late in the 2nd century, a governor of Britain decided that he would prefer to be emperor, which was a common enough ambition and a reasonable one on the evidence, since he had 3 legions and a strong claim and a rival who had just seized the throne in the usual manner. So he took most of the garrison of Britain across the sea to Gaul and fought an enormous battle near what is now Lyme and lost it and died. The victor, a hard, humorless, spectacularly effective soldier from North Africa, then had a province at the far end of his empire whose army had just backed the other man and whose northern frontier had spent 2 years with nobody watching it. He split Britain into 2 provinces so that no single governor would ever have 3 legions again, which was sensible, and then, being who he was, he came to deal with the north himself. He arrived in the year 208, an old man with gout, carried much of the way in a litter, bringing with him his wife, his 2 adult sons who detested each other, the imperial court, the treasury, and a field army of perhaps 50,000. He based himself at the northern fortress on the river at York, and for 3 seasons he pushed north into Scotland with the aim not of defeating the northern peoples, but of eliminating them, and the northern peoples sensibly refused to be found. They melted into the hills and the marshes and struck the column and vanished. And the campaign became what such campaigns become: enormous marching camps, enormous expense, huge supply bases on the coast, and very little to show at the end of the season except a treaty that would be broken. He died at York in the winter of the year 211, worn out. The tradition is that his last advice to his quarreling sons was to get along with each other, enrich the soldiers, and despise everybody else, and it is a fair summary of how he had governed. His sons abandoned the northern campaign immediately, went home to fight each other, and one of them killed the other within the year. But the North stayed remarkably quiet for a long time afterwards, which suggests that although the campaign had failed in its stated aim, it had made an impression. And there is a lesson somewhere in that about how much of security is theater. What follows is the 3rd century, and the 3rd century nearly ended the empire everywhere. Plague swept through. The silver coinage was debased again and again until a silver coin was a copper coin with a wash on it, and prices went the way prices go when everyone works that out. Whole regions broke away under their own emperors. For 14 years there was a separate Gallic empire, and Britain was part of it, and then it was reabsorbed. Raiding intensified on every frontier at once, and Britain, remarkably, had rather a good century. Not entirely. There was inflation here too, and the towns began their long, slow change of character. And some public buildings were not repaired when they failed. But the island was a long way from the disasters. Its frontier held, its farms produced, and the money that had been going into public monuments went instead into private estates, which is why the great age of the British villa begins now and peaks in the century after. Wealth was moving out of the town center and onto the land, which is a pattern with consequences we will come back to at the end. The one genuinely new problem was the sea. Along the coasts of the North Sea and the Channel, raiders in shallow draught boats began to appear. Saxons and Franks from the German and Danish coasts, and Irish raiders on the western side. Not invasion. Raiding, which is worse for ordinary life, because an invasion is an event and raiding is a climate. So the empire built forts along the south and east coasts, a chain of them, and these are not like the earlier forts at all. These have thick, high walls with projecting round towers for artillery, few gates, and the look of a place designed to be defended. When you see that change in military architecture in any period, you are looking at a change in what people are afraid of. The command of that coast and of the fleet was given in the late 280s to an able and ambitious officer from the Low Countries. He was extremely successful at intercepting raiders, and a persistent rumor said he was letting them make their raids and then taking the loot off them on the way home, which, if true, is a business model of admirable simplicity. Ordered to answer for it, he did the arithmetic that everyone in this story keeps doing, decided the answer was no, and declared himself Emperor of Britain and Northern Gaul. And here is the extraordinary thing. It worked for 7 years. He had the fleet, and whoever has the fleet has the island. For 7 years there was a Britain that was Roman in every particular and independent in fact, ruled from London, minting its own money, defending its own coast. He was murdered by his own finance minister, who took over and lasted 3 years. And then the Central Empire came for the island with a fleet of its own. They crossed in fog, which meant they slipped past the defending navy entirely, burned their own ships on landing so that nobody would be tempted by second thoughts, and the whole business was settled in one battle somewhere in the south. The victorious commander arrived at London to find his own troops looting it and stopped them. And a gold medallion struck to celebrate the moment shows the city personified kneeling at the gate to welcome him, with the legend naming him the restorer of the eternal light. That same commander's son was in the province a decade later, at York at his father's side when he died there in the year 306. And the troops in the northern fortress promptly proclaimed the son emperor on the spot. He spent the next 18 years making it stick, and by the end of it he had reunited the whole empire under himself, moved its center east to a new city on the Bosphorus, and made Christianity a legal and then a favored religion, which changed the next 1,500 years of European history. So the man who did all that was acclaimed in a fortress in Yorkshire by a garrison that included the descendants of men who had come there to fight the Brigantes. Meanwhile, the empire had been reorganized from top to bottom by an administrator of ferocious energy, and Britain was carved from 2 provinces into 4, later 5, each with a governor, all under a vicar of the diocese. With the military command split off from the civil one entirely and given to separate officers, a count of the coast, a duke of the northern frontier, and later a mobile field army under its own count. More layers, more officials, more paperwork, higher taxes to pay for the officials, and a state that was heavier, more anxious, and much more present in ordinary life than the light-touch province of the 2nd century had been, which is what happens in every century when a system that has had a fright decides never to be surprised again. Before we go on, we should look over the wall, because for 3 centuries the province had neighbors, and we have been talking as though the map simply stopped at the ditch. it did not. North of the wall there was a whole country of people living much as their cousins to the south had lived before the conquest, in farmsteads and hill forts and in the far north and the Isles. In the extraordinary dry stone towers of the Atlantic coast, circular, hollow-walled, 3 stories high, with a stair running up inside the thickness of the wall itself, built by people with no mortar, no cranes, and a very great deal of patience. Between the wall and the highlands lay the peoples the army dealt with most, kingdoms in the lowlands who were, at different times, allies, clients, hostages, trading partners in problems. Patrols went out. Scouts, in the later period a specialized corps of frontier intelligence men who lived among the northern communities and reported back, went further still. And it was those men who were bribed before the great coordinated attack, which tells you both how useful they were and how they could be turned. Roman goods flowed north continuously, pottery, glass, brooches, coins, and above all silver, given as subsidy and gift to keep the right kings friendly. That is the frontier's real business model, and it is the one every empire uses. Pay the near neighbors to keep the far neighbors off you, and hope you never run out of silver or of near neighbors. Then, in the late 3rd century, a new name appears in the Roman sources for the peoples of the north, and it means, more or less, the painted ones. What is clear is that by the 4th century the north had consolidated into a smaller number of larger and more capable kingdoms, which is what tends to happen to a people who spend 200 years next door to an organized state. You either organize or you get absorbed. They built no towns and left no literature, but they carved standing stones with symbols nobody has yet convincingly read, and they raided by sea as well as by land, and they were, by the end, a serious military power that could put a coordinated force in the field alongside allies from across the water. To the west, across the Irish Sea, was the one island in these waters that Rome never took. Instead, there was trade, and there were exiles, and eventually there was raiding, and the raiders came in numbers to the western coasts in the 4th and 5th centuries, took cattle, took goods, and took people, because the great commodity of the ancient world was always people. And one of the people they took gives us the single most personal document from the very end of Roman Britain. A boy of about 16, from a well-off Christian family with an estate somewhere on the west coast, the son of a town councillor and deacon, was carried off in a raid and sold as a slave in Ireland, where he spent 6 years herding sheep on a cold hillside, found a faith he had been raised in but never taken seriously, escaped, walked 200 miles to a ship, got home, and then, years later, went back voluntarily to the country that had enslaved him as a bishop. He wrote an account of it in bad, plain, urgent Latin, apologizing repeatedly for how badly he wrote, because his education had been interrupted at 16 by being kidnapped. It is the only autobiography from Roman Britain. The man who wrote it is now the patron saint of Ireland. And the reason his Latin is rough is that a boatload of raiders came up a British estuary one morning and changed his life before he had finished school. And to the east, across the North Sea, were the peoples who would matter most of all. The coasts of what is now northern Germany, Denmark, and the Low Countries held communities of farmers and fishermen, and, increasingly, of men who went to sea in long, open rowing boats. We have one of those boats, preserved in a bog, about 80 feet long, clinker built of overlapping oak planks, fastened with iron rivets, light, flexible, shallow, rowed by 30 men, with no mast at all in the earliest examples. Against a coast with towns and villas on it, and no navy watching every mile, it is close to ideal. They came first for loot. Then, as the empire's grip loosened, they came to be hired, because the standard late Roman solution to a shortage of soldiers was to pay the people who were raiding you to defend you against the people who were raiding you, and it worked, in the short run, for a surprisingly long time. Then, when the payment stopped, they came for land and brought their households. That is the world outside the frontier by the end of the 3rd century, a consolidated north, a raiding west, and an east where the sea, which had been the province's safest border for 300 years, had quietly turned into its most dangerous one. The forts along the south and east coasts, with their high walls and their artillery towers, are the visible sign of the change. Nothing about that was hopeless. But it meant that the province's safety now depended on a fleet, a coastal command, and a mobile field army, all of which were expensive, and all of which could be taken away by anyone in Britain who fancied his chances at becoming emperor, which, as we have seen, was a thing that happened here rather more often than anywhere else, and which was about to happen again. And then comes the 4th century, which is the strangest part of the whole story, because by every visible measure it is the province at its richest, and it is also the last one. If you had toured the West Country and the South in the middle of that century, you would have concluded that Britain had never been better off. The villas were at their peak, enormous, elaborate, comfortable places with dozens of rooms and heated floors and glazed corridors and mosaic pavements of a quality that had no equal in the Northwestern Empire. One in the Western Hills has a great courtyard house at its heart, and a mosaic of the seasons around a dancing figure that is nearly 50 feet across. Elsewhere there are floors with sea creatures, hunting scenes, philosophers, and in one house, in the same building, is a room decorated with the old gods, a small chapel with painted figures standing with their arms raised in prayer, and a Christian monogram on the wall. Because Christianity had arrived quietly sometime in the 3rd century in the ordinary way that things arrive. Along the trade routes, in the households of merchants and soldiers, among the enslaved, spreading without any of it being written down by anybody who mattered. By the year 314, only a couple of years after it became legal, 3 British bishops were at a church council in southern Gaul with a priest and a deacon, which means that by then Britain had an organized church with a hierarchy and enough money to send a delegation abroad, and that it had had one for a while, and the old gods were not finished. In the same century, on a hill above the Severn, somebody built an entirely new temple complex to an entirely British god, with a guest house and baths for pilgrims who came to sleep on the site in the hope of being healed, and left behind little bronze dogs, because the god's animal was a dog and dogs licked wounds, and that was the connection. New temple. 4th century, long after the empire had officially gone the other way. People are not tidy about belief, and the idea that one religion politely closed while another opened is a thing that only happens in diagrams. So, rich, cultured, comfortable, well-fed, with a functioning church and a functioning market and floors that would not be equaled in this country for 1,000 years. And underneath all that, 3 slow problems, each of which was survivable on its own. The first was that the towns were changing. Public buildings that fell down were often not rebuilt. Forums were subdivided or turned over to industry. There is a great basilica in the north where the hall ends its life as a metalworking shop, and another town where the baths become a granary. This is not necessarily decline in the way it sounds, but a town that is not maintaining its public buildings is a town that has lost the argument about what it is for. The second was that the army in Britain had been reduced repeatedly by ambitious men taking troops abroad to make themselves emperor. It happened in the late 2nd century. It happened again in the 4th, twice. Every time, a proportion of those troops never came back. The third was the sea and the north, both getting worse. The raiders were more numerous, better organized, and now sometimes coordinated. And in the year 367, in a coincidence of numbers that I promise I did not arrange. Exactly that many years after the landing on the shingle, something happened that the sources call the Barbarian Conspiracy. The northern peoples, the Irish from the west, and the Saxons from across the North Sea, all attacked at once. In a coordinated way, which had never happened before and which suggests communication between them that nobody in the province had thought possible. The frontier scouts on the wall, it seems, had been bribed to look the other way. The commander of the coast was killed. The commander of the northern frontier was cut off and captured. Raiding parties got deep into the province, some of them all the way to the southeast, and for something like a year there was no effective government across large parts of Britain, with deserters and escaped slaves joining in and the countryside left to arrange its own protection. The empire's response took 2 years and was, on the face of it, a complete success. A senior general was sent with a field army, landed in the southeast, secured London, offered an amnesty to deserters, hunted the raiding bands down one at a time as they made for the coast with their loads, restored the northern command, rebuilt the frontier posts, put new watchtowers along the northeast coast to see raiders coming, and reorganized the whole defense of the diocese. On paper it was fixed. But things do not go back. The countryside had learned in that year that the army might not come. The frontier scouts had been unreliable, and the sheer scale of the response an imperial field army sent from the continent told everyone that the province could no longer look after itself out of its own resources. What follows is a sequence of departures, and this is the part people mean when they ask when the Romans left, and the honest answer is that there was never a day. In the year 383, the commander in Britain was proclaimed emperor by his troops and took a large part of the garrison across to Gaul to make good on it. He ruled the western provinces for 5 years and was then defeated and killed, and the men he took did not come home. Welsh tradition remembered him for 1,000 years afterwards as a legendary emperor with a British wife, and several early Welsh royal houses traced their descent from him, which tells you what a hole he left and what people built in it. Then the frontier posts thinned. The great fortress cities kept garrisons, but smaller ones went quiet. Then, around the very end of the 4th century, troops were withdrawn again for the defense of Italy, which was by then being invaded in a way that made a wet island seem an unaffordable luxury. And then the coin stopped. That is the clearest and most brutal single line in the archaeology. New coin arrived in Britain in bulk, year after year, decade after decade, for 3.5 centuries. Because the state shipped it in to pay the troops and the officials. Around the year 402, the shipments stopped, not because people rejected them, because the mechanism that put them there had switched off, and a province that has been running on coin for 300 years, with markets and wages and rents and taxes all denominated in it, does not adapt to that in an afternoon. The pottery industries fail within about a decade because a mass production industry needs a cash market, and there is no longer one. The mass-produced goods vanish from the sites. The scale of everything shrinks hard and fast. In the year 406, a group of peoples crossed the frozen Rhine in enormous numbers, and the western frontier came apart. The army in Britain, seeing that the continent was collapsing and that they were unlikely to be defended by anybody who was themselves undefended, did the traditional thing and made an emperor. They went through two in quick succession and then settled on a soldier whose main qualification appears to have been his name, which was the same as that of the great emperor proclaimed at York a century before, and in the year 407 he took what was left of the mobile army across to Gaul. He never came back either, and that, effectively, was the garrison. Which brings us to the year 410, the date in every textbook, and it deserves an honest look, because it is nothing like as clean as it sounds. In that year, with the province being raided and no field army left, the civil authorities of Britain, the councils of the towns, wrote to the emperor in Italy asking for help. The emperor, whose own capital was at that moment about to be sacked for the first time in 800 years, wrote back telling the cities of Britain to look to their own defense. That is it. That is the end of Roman Britain. Not a battle, not a treaty, not a withdrawal ceremony with the standards coming down. A letter, in effect a shrug, from a government that had run out of everything, telling a diocese that had been part of the empire for 367 years that it was on its own now. And best of luck. And here is the thing nobody tells you about that date. For the people living through it, almost nothing visible changed that year. The sun came up, the wheat was sown in the autumn as it always was. The councils went on meeting, the bishops went on being bishops, the landowners went on owning land. There was no announcement, no last ship, no farewell. A person in a villa in the West Country in the year 411 was still a Roman, spoke Latin, worshipped in a Roman way, farmed a Roman estate, and would have been baffled to be told that they were now living in a different historical period. The empire had not been abolished. It had simply stopped sending anything and stopped asking for anything. And it took a while for anyone to be certain which of those was permanent. The unraveling that followed was slow, uneven, and mostly a matter of things not being replaced. The pottery went first, as we said, because a factory needs customers with coin. Then the wheel-thrown pot itself disappears from most of the country, and people go back to making pots by hand at home, badly. Which is one of the saddest sentences in British archaeology, not because handmade pots are shameful, but because it means that the network which had let a farmer in the Midlands buy a good cheap bowl made 100 miles away had ceased to exist inside a single lifetime. Then the buildings. A tiled roof needs a tiler, and a tiler needs a tilery, and a tilery needs a market. A mosaic needs a workshop of specialists who train apprentices for years, and the last apprentice was taken on at some point, and nobody knows when. So the great houses were not destroyed. They were occupied more simply. Hearths built directly on the mosaic floors, partitions put up in the big rooms, one wing kept weathertight and the rest allowed to go, grain stored in the bath suite. Cattle in the courtyard. There is a villa where a corn-drying oven was installed in the middle of a fine dining floor, and used until the tesserae cracked with the heat. Somebody was still there. They were just no longer able or no longer inclined to keep up a house that had been built for a world with an imperial post service in it. The towns thinned in the same way. Some kept a population for decades, huddled around a church or a market with timber buildings put up in the old street lines. Some were abandoned entirely and became, for a few centuries, quarries, a marvelous supply of ready-cut stone for anyone building anything, which is why so many Saxon church towers are made of visibly Roman brick, and why the Great Wall in the north survives in long stretches near the crags and vanishes entirely where there were farms and villages within cart distance. The wall was not destroyed. It was recycled into byres and field boundaries and churches and eventually into a military road built along it in the 18th century by an army chasing rebels, which is a very Roman use for a Roman thing. The people, meanwhile, did what people do. Some buried their money. The hoards from those decades are astonishing. Silver spoons, gold chains, thousands of coins, buried carefully in the corner of a room or under a floor, in the confident expectation of coming back for it, by people who never did. One hoard in the east contains a set of silver gilt pepper pots, one of them shaped as the bust of a woman with her hair in the elaborate fashion of the very last Roman decades. Somebody owned that. Somebody set the table with it and made a decision one autumn and dug a hole. Some fought and organized. There were British kings again within a generation or two, ruling from refortified hill forts. Some of them the very same hill forts that had been stormed 400 years earlier and left empty ever since. The ditches were recut, the banks were built up, the wheel came all the way round. And some invited the newcomers in, or hired them, or were displaced by them, and here the story becomes the beginning of an entirely different story that I will not start tonight. Saxons, Angles, Jutes, Frisians, coming first as raiders, then as hired troops paid in land, then as settlers with their families, then as kings. Not one invasion, a long, complicated, region-by-region century of arrival, in which some places changed hands violently and others simply changed language over 3 generations without anybody moving house. By the year 600, the eastern half of the country spoke English, and the western half in the north still spoke British, and the border between those two facts is one you can still hear today. What did they leave? The 367 years? The roads. That is the biggest single thing, and you use them without thinking. The long, straight stretches of the old lines are still the framework of English travel, the road northwest out of London, the road to the northeast, the great diagonal across the middle. Villages sit along them because they were there before the villages. Parish boundaries follow them. Even where the surface has been replaced 20 times, the alignment is theirs. Chosen by a surveyor with a sighting instrument on a hilltop in the 1st century for reasons that no longer exist and that still determine which way you drive. The towns. Not all of them, but very many. Every English place name that ends in the syllable that means camp or wall town, which is dozens of them, sits on a Roman site. London is where it is because of a Roman bridge over the tidal reach of a river. York, Lincoln, Chester, Bath, Gloucester, Exeter, Colchester, Canterbury, Winchester, Carlisle. All of them are Roman decisions that nobody has ever seen a good reason to reverse. The Wall. 73 miles of it, in the wind, going up over the crags and down into the gaps with the ditch beside it and the foundations of the mile castles at their measured intervals, and the forts with their granaries and their bathhouses and the outlines of the streets, and the tombstones and the altars and the birthday invitation now under glass in a museum a few miles from the mud it came out of. It is still there. You can walk the whole length of it in a week, in the rain, and be passed by sheep who have opinions about tourists. And underneath everything, a layer. Under the fields, the outlines of the villas show up as crop marks in a dry summer, pale lines in the barley where the wheat is thinner over buried stone. Under the streets of the cities, the layers go down through everything. Medieval cellars, then dark earth, then the burnt clay of that terrible summer, then gravel, then the first ditch anybody dug there. And out in the plowed fields, all over the country, a little of it comes up every single year, turned over by the share and lying on the surface for anybody who is looking down. None of it needs anything from you. That is what I like about it. The wall does not require your attention to go on standing. The road under the road does not need to be admired. The pepper pot in the case does not know that the woman who owned it has been dead for 1,600 years, and the woman who wrote the birthday invitation did not know she was writing to us. And the soldier who carved his complaint into the quarry face had no idea that the complaint would outlast the empire, the language, and the reason for the quarry. They were all just getting through a day, the way you got through today. 367 years, long enough that a family could have lived in the same district for 15 generations without once knowing a world in which Rome was not simply how things were. Long enough for the whole thing to arrive, be resisted, be accepted, become ordinary, become old, become the past, and go, without any single person ever seeing more than a slice of it. And then the ship stopped coming, and the ground kept the shape. Go back for a moment to where we started. The shingle beach on the warm gray morning, the tide going out, the low broad ships, the mules coming down the planks, the man pacing out a rectangle in the turf above the tide line. That beach is still there. The line of it has moved because coasts move. And the marshes behind it have silted and been drained and grazed and built on, and the harbor that held 400 ships is now a green flat place with sheep on it and a small stone monument that most people drive past. But the shingle is the same shingle, and it makes the same sound under your feet, and on a warm gray morning at the end of summer, the light on the water there is exactly the light those men saw, because light does not change. Somewhere under that turf is the ditch, the first one, the rectangle they dug before they did anything else, because that is what they always did on the Rhine, in Spain, in Syria, and now here. 367 years later, the last of their descendants and successors read a letter telling them that no more help was coming, and went out to see to the harvest anyway, because the harvest does not care who is in charge. And it is all still out there tonight, quietly, in the dark, not needing anybody. The wall going over the crags with the wind in the heather, the straight roads under the newer roads, the buried nails still bright in the middle of the pile, the mosaic floors sleeping under the barley, showing their outlines only in a dry summer, the hot spring in the west country coming up out of the ground at the same steady temperature it has kept since long before anyone gave it a name. Still rising, still steaming into the cold air of a February morning, still carrying, somewhere in the silt at the bottom of it, a thin sheet of lead on which somebody once scratched a furious little complaint about a stolen cloak. History does not go anywhere. It just becomes the ground beneath our feet, and the shape of the fields, and the direction of the roads we take without wondering why they run that way. So that is the whole of it. 367 years, from the first landing to the last legion, from a ditch on a beach to a letter that arrived too late to matter. You do not need to remember any of it. It has already happened. It happened without us, and it will go on being over whether we are awake or not. If you are still awake, there is another long, quiet one waiting for you on the screen, and it will start on its own if you let it, so you do not have to move or find anything or make a single decision. If this one helped tonight, a like does genuinely help other people find their way here. And you are very welcome to subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it in the morning, leave your location and your local time down in the comments, so that the next person lying awake at some impossible hour can scroll down and see that they are in good company. Now, let the last of it go. Let your shoulders drop 1 more inch, the way they did an hour ago on the beach with the low ships coming in. Let the room be dark and warm and unimportant. Let the walls stand out there in the wind without you. Let the tide go out. Close your eyes. Good night and sweet dreams.